the beginning of the nightmare. In the early morning of August 24, 2001, at Toronto Pearson Airport, an Airbus A330 of Air Transat, Flight 236, began to taxi away from the gate. On board were 293 passengers and 13 crew members, preparing for a transatlantic flight of more than 7 hours to Lisbon, Portugal. Before takeoff, the aircraft was loaded with nearly 47 tons of fuel, 5 tons more than the mandated minimum, enough for a safe flight across the vast ocean. Captain Robert Pichet, a seasoned pilot with over 17,000 flight hours, along with young First Officer Dirk de Jager, sat in the familiar cockpit of the A330. They performed a final check of the engine parameters, fuel system, and pressure, and everything showed green, stable, safe. There was no warning sign that only a few hours later, the entire flight would become one of the most serious incidents in the history of modern civil aviation. The A330 left the runway, heading straight east. The Canadian night was silent. The ocean ahead was merely an endless dark expanse. When the aircraft reached its cruising altitude of 39,000 feet, all parameters remained within the standard limits. In the cockpit, the dim blue light from the control panel reflected on the faces of the two pilots, who believed they were conducting a normal flight like thousands before. Neither of them knew that deep inside the aircraft's right wing, a small technical detail from maintenance 4 days earlier was waiting to trigger a chain of events that would test all limits of skill, courage, and luck. The small flaw. 4 days before the fateful flight, the Airbus A330 Air Transat Flight 236 was brought into the maintenance hangar to replace one of its 2 engines. The reason seemed simple. Technicians found metal shavings in the oil, a sign of internal engine wear. The engine replacement procedure is familiar in the aviation industry, but this time was different. The replacement engine was not the same configuration as the old one. One was a pre-service type, and the other was post-service, meaning there were minor differences in the design of the pipes and accessories. The technical team had to find a way to make it fit. They bent, adjusted, and reassembled the fuel and hydraulic line system in a temporary manner, just enough for the plane to operate stably on the ground. No one on the technical team or the flight crew knew that only a few days later, it was from this point of contact that tons of fuel would leak out over the Atlantic Ocean, turning a routine flight into a fight for survival in the air. The misinterpreted sign. As the Airbus A330 left Canadian airspace and headed into the Atlantic, everything seemed normal. On the control panel, the indicators gradually stabilized. But a few hours later, something strange began to appear. The oil pressure of the right engine increased, while the temperature decreased. The fuel imbalance warning, an imbalance of fuel between the 2 wings, illuminated. It is a common warning, often occurring when a sensor is faulty or the electronic system temporarily malfunctions. Based on years of experience, the crew believed they were facing a display error. They rechecked the system, called the maintenance center in Toronto, but no one considered the possibility of an actual fuel leak. In the cold night air over the Atlantic, the A330 remained stable, further reinforcing the belief that this was only a false warning. According to procedure, when there is a fuel imbalance, the pilots open a valve to transfer fuel from the heavy wing to the light wing to balance the aircraft. They did exactly that. But that action, instead of solving the problem, unknowingly paved the way to disaster. The balance valve connecting the 2 wings allowed fuel to flow through the pierced pipe, and through it, tons of fuel were suctioned out faster. On the control panel, the readings still appeared logical, as the system could not measure the actual amount of fuel lost. In a few hours, that large aircraft lost up to 12 to 15 tons of fuel without anyone realizing it. That was a human error, not due to carelessness, but due to trusting technology more than technical intuition. And in the world of aviation, Just one such misjudgment is enough to determine the fate of an entire flight. When procedures were ignored. The fuel imbalance warning remained on, but the Airbus A330 continued to fly steadily and the engines ran smoothly. For the flight crew, this further reinforced their belief that it was only a sensor error or a software glitch. They had seen similar false warnings in the past, and each time it was just system noise. That belief caused them to overlook the more serious possibility, an actual fuel leak. In the flight manual, Airbus has a clear procedure for a fuel leak situation. It requires pilots to close valves, isolate the system, monitor the fuel level in each engine, and identify the cause. But in this case, that procedure was never performed. They did not correctly name the problem, so they did not take the correct steps to handle it. Investigators later called this a framing bias, the psychological tendency for people to focus only on the hypothesis they believe to be correct, and then arrange all the facts to reinforce that belief. When the pilots believed the error came from the electronic system, all other signs, oil pressure, low temperature, rapid fuel level decrease, were interpreted as harmless. The consequence of that perceptual deviation was horrific. Had they strictly followed the fuel leak procedure, the aircraft would have had enough fuel to land safely with about 4 tons left in the tanks. But instead, the fuel continued to pour out through the pierced line. Now, they were no longer simply facing a warning, but an aircraft crossing the Atlantic that was slowly running out of fuel, and no one in the cockpit realized it. When the sky went silent. When the fuel level dropped to a critical level, the crew was forced to act. They requested a diversion to Lajes Air Base on the Azores Islands, the nearest landing point in the middle of the Atlantic. But by then, there was not much time left. The fuel level dropped faster than any calculation, and only a few minutes later, the right engine had to shut down. The warning sounded, then fell silent. The Airbus A330 lost half of its thrust. They tried to maintain altitude, trying to prolong the remaining distance. But the fuel in the left wing was also running out. When the clock showed less than 2 minutes later, the remaining engine also stopped operating. Both sides were silent. The plane now had no engines, no electricity, no hydraulic pressure. A passenger aircraft weighing over 180 tons was gliding in the air in the middle of the night over the Atlantic Ocean. The cabin was plunged into darkness with only a few dim lights from the emergency panel. The air turbine, or RAT, a small propeller mounted outside the fuselage, deployed, providing just enough electricity to retain the most basic systems: compass, radio, and basic controls. No autopilot, no electronic assistance. From that moment, the pilots had to control the A330 like a giant glider, flying entirely by feel and experience. At an altitude of over 10,000 meters, they began to calculate flight speed, wind direction, the remaining distance to Lajes. There was no room for error. Every degree of bank, every wing adjustment maneuver was life or death. The aircraft was now a colossal piece of metal, silently slicing through the night, devoid of engine power, relying only on human skill to bring it back to the ground.
The unbelievable landing in the middle of the Atlantic. As the Air Transat Airbus A330 glided through the night with both engines dead, the only remaining goal was the Lajes runway, over 120 kilometers away. Altitude dropped rapidly. The speed was still higher than the safe limit. No engines meant no thrust to adjust, no hydraulic system for deploying flaps or speed brakes. The crew could only rely on wind speed and the wing's angle of attack to keep the enormous aircraft under control. When the Azores coastline appeared, they knew this was their last chance. The aircraft descended at a speed of over 200 knots, much faster than the normal landing standard. Upon touchdown, the main landing gear bounced violently. Tires exploded, metal scraped the asphalt, and sparks flew. The emergency braking system worked at its maximum. The fuselage shook violently. In that moment, everything was just friction between metal and concrete. The A330 slid for over 2 kilometers, then stopped only about 180 meters from the end of the runway. Fire erupted near the wheels, and thick smoke filled the air, but the fuselage remained intact. No one perished. All 306 people on the flight evacuated within 90 seconds, strictly following emergency procedures. A miracle that experts later called the longest unpowered glide landing in commercial aviation history. But what is noteworthy is not just the crew's skill, but how the entire system, from maintenance techniques to training, allowed small errors to lead to an unimaginable situation. This survival was a rare stroke of luck, but it also exposed the fragile boundary between technical standard and air disaster.
When technical errors met human limits. In the world of aviation, every small deviation can create a deadly chain reaction. The case of Air Transat 236 is a typical example of this. It all started with a detail that seemed harmless. A fuel line in the engine was installed incorrectly after the maintenance process. That small flaw created a leak point, and from there, fuel began to leak out into the air throughout the journey. In the cockpit, the crew noticed unusual readings but came to the wrong conclusion. They believed it was just a fuel imbalance, not a leak. Their handling procedure, trained under the fuel imbalance model, made the situation worse. Fuel from the other side was transferred to the leaking side, literally adding fuel to the fire. By the time they realized what was happening, it was too late. The A330 ran out of fuel over the Atlantic, but the flight crew still managed to control the aircraft as it silently glided for tens of nautical miles and landed safely on Terceira Island. A feat of flying skill, but also a harsh warning about the vulnerabilities in the training and technical systems. The subsequent investigation report clearly pointed out 3 causes: installation error, lack of training for a fuel leak situation, and confusion when analyzing data in the cockpit. Airbus had to update its fuel warning system and rebuild its global training procedures. For industry professionals, this was not just a near catastrophic accident.